equals investment, we will have net foreign lending. If the world interest rate is below the domestic interest rate that would equate savings and investment, then we would have net foreign borrowing. Now, the other thing that we might be interested in thinking about is how will various variables change in our model if there's a shock of one sort or another. So one of the shocks that we could think about would be, as we talked about before, a decrease in government purchases, right? A decrease in government purchases. But remember, there's a group of three types of exogenous variables in the supply of loanable funds equation. We have autonomous consumption, we have taxes, and we have government purchases. So if we are to reduce government purchases, well, we need somewhere along here we need a world interest rate. Let's put world interest rate in. So in this case, I've drawn it so that we have a net export surplus. Yes? It does. What, R naught is only the interest rate. So the question was, I thought that the real interest rate had to equal the world real interest rate. The answer is it does. R naught here is not the interest rate that exists in this small open economy. It is simply the interest rate that would equate the supply of loanable funds with the demand for loanable funds. Right? So that's all that we're looking at. So now let's think about this reduction in government purchases. What happens? So the first thing we want to think about is, okay, here's a shock to the economy. We call it a shock because it's a change in the value of an exogenous variable. Remember, so don't think anything terrible about the word shock. We only mean a change in an exogenous variable. So in this case, the first thing we should be asking ourselves, does a change in government purchases affect the supply of loanable funds or the demand for loanable funds? Supply of loanable funds, right? Okay, so we know now that the supply of loanable funds is going to shift because government purchases is not on either of the axes, and government purchases influences the supply of loanable funds function. Okay? So it's going to shift. Is it going to shift to the left or to the right? To the right. A decrease in government purchases will increase government saving and therefore increase national saving. At every real interest rate level, the amount of national saving has now increased. So now we've seen the supply of loanable funds move to the right. Now what else happens? Remember, let's think about our model. Other exogenous variables will not change in value. However, all of our endogenous variables will. Or could. So what doesn't change that we know for sure? Small open economy. The real world interest rate is an exogenous variable. Right? What has happened here, this change in government purchases in this small open economy will not influence the real world interest rate. So the real world interest rate doesn't change. Well, that's interesting because what that implies is that the investment will also not change. Even though investment is an endogenous variable, it depends upon the real world interest rate. Since the real world interest rate did not change, investment won't change. But notice that even though saving depends on, wait a minute. Now see, you're supposed to have caught me on that. But I caught myself, so I don't have to say my bad. So saving will still increase from S1 to S2. And in fact, saving will increase by exactly the amount of the decline in government purchases. No, S2. Right? So this is our closed economy. This is where we have an open economy. This is after the shock. So we also see that net exports increased. And in fact, because the real world interest rate did not change, net exports increased, the net export surplus increased by exactly the same amount of the decline in government purchases. Okay. So savings increased, and net export surpluses increased by exactly the reduction in government purchases. Okay. Why? The real world interest rate didn't change. So the demand for loanable funds doesn't change. Change the supply of loanable funds, it's all going to flow out of the country if the domestic demand for loanable funds is not changing. Now, just to make sure you understand what's happening, you should work out on your own, or maybe with your GSI or friends, what happens if the real world interest rate was low. And what you should see, in any case, is an increase in desired savings will have the following effects. No change on the real interest rate. No change on desired investment. An increase in net exports balance, which also means an increase in net foreign lending, assuming that we are lending, or a reduction in net foreign borrowing if we're a borrower. Now, we can also ask, what happens if we had an increase in autonomous investment? The example we used last time is business executives become much more optimistic about the economy for whatever reason. So let's again think about this in the context of a country with a net export surplus. So this is our starting position, and now we have an increase in autonomous investment. Again, the way we want to think about this is our exogenous shock, right? Autonomous means exogenous. So it's pretty easy to see that autonomous investment affects the investment function, not the saving function. So it's pretty easy to identify which function is going to shift. Okay. Since this is an increase in autonomous investment, it suggests we will have more investment for every real interest rate level. So our investment demand has shifted to the right. Now with our small open economy, again, it's pretty easy to see exactly what's happening. The real world interest rate does not change. Investment rises by the full amount of the autonomous change. Saving does not change. There's been no change in the real world interest rate. There's been no change in any of the autonomous spending components. Net exports, the net export surplus, has been reduced. In fact, it will be reduced by exactly the same amount as the autonomous spending, the autonomous investment increase. So as you can see, working with small open economies is actually relatively straightforward once you know the real world interest rate. And of course, you can properly identify the exogenous shock. So as we just saw, oh, by the way, I would be remiss if I didn't encourage you to work out the situation if the real world interest rate was low. Okay, so our increase in desired investment, no change in the real interest rate, no change in desired saving. We reduce the country's net export balance. We reduce net foreign lending, and we increase, or if otherwise, we would increase net foreign borrowing if that was our situation. So notice that this is simply supply and demand analysis. The real world interest rate being fixed with small open economies simply means this is supply and demand analysis with a fixed price level. Now, let's think about what would happen in a large open economy. So open, as we've already discussed, simply means that we have international trade and we're assuming perfect capital mobility. But what we mean by a large country is one that is sufficiently big in terms of international financial capital flows that changes in those flows would affect the real world interest rate. What that means then is that the real world interest rate has now become an endogenous variable. It's no longer exogenous. This is the big change from small open economies. So the real world interest rate is no longer a given. Now it turns out that there are not that many countries or regions that are considered to be large economies in this context. The United States clearly is in that category, as is the European Union, or the subset is the Euro region. China would be in that category, even though they don't have perfect capital mobility. Japan, Germany, if we didn't count them as part of the Euro or the EU, and the UK, if we didn't count them as part of the EU. It may not be a large economy if Scotland decides to leave, but that's neither here nor there. Okay, so the easiest way to think about large open economies is to pick one of those economies, let's just call it the U.S., and treat the rest of the world as a single economy. So now, of course, we've got two large economies. So here's the situation pre-perfect capital mobility. We've got the U.S. over here with a relatively low domestic interest rate, and we've got the rest of the world over on the right with a relatively high foreign domestic real interest rate. Once we open it up to perfect capital mobility, once again, a perfect arbitrage opportunity unfolds. Savers in the U.S. are now going to want to send their funds abroad to capture the higher interest rate. Borrowers abroad are going to want to borrow in the U.S. to try and achieve the low interest rate. These changes in relative supply and demand are going to force the real interest rate towards each other. So in the U.S., the real interest rate will rise, and in the rest of the world, the real interest rate will fall. Now notice, in the U.S., as the real interest rate begins to rise, there'll be an increase in desired saving, there'll be a decrease in desired investment. We will now have a net export surplus, net foreign lending. In the rest of the world, just the opposite. The real interest rate is coming down. That means there'll be an increase in the demand for loanable funds. There will be a decrease in the supply of loanable funds. In order to finance the increase in investment, they will have to import financial capital from the United States. That is, the rest of the world will have a net export deficit. Because we only have two countries, the net export surplus for the United States must equal the net export deficit for the rest of the world. The net foreign lending of the United States must exactly equal the net foreign borrowing of the rest of the world. That gives us a hint as to where we're going to end up. Now we know we're going to end up somewhere in between the two situations. So let's just suppose we go to this real world interest rate. So what we see is, again, an increase in the interest rate for the United States, which leads to less investment and more national saving, and a net export surplus. However, the real interest rate is now falling in the rest of the world, which leads to a decline in saving and an increase in investment. And that gives rise to a net export deficit. This surplus and this deficit must be the same orders of magnitude. So the real world interest rate is going to adjust to find the level where the U.S.'s net foreign lending, net export surplus, net financial capital outflows, net foreign investment, is identical in magnitude to the rest of the world's net foreign borrowing, net financial capital inflows, net export deficit. Right? They must be the same size. Yes?
In like the real world, are they smaller than like what they actually import and export? Is it that cost or?
No, because we include the transaction costs in imports and exports. No. They're not the same because we can't measure them that accurately, but it's much easier to measure imports than it is exports. I'll tell you why later. Okay, so again, the real-world interest rate must adjust to find that spot where international lending by the surplus countries is exactly equal to international borrowing by the deficit countries. Now again, let's think about the shocks that we've been talking about. So what would happen in this case if there's a decline in government purchases? Right? That's the example we've been working with. So if we have a decline in government purchases in the domestic economy, let's call this the U.S. economy. It's easier for me to remember. Okay, so we're now in equilibrium. The U.S. government now reduces its government purchases. We already know that this means that the saving function will shift to the right. Now at this point, it's important to remember that the real-world interest rate is an endogenous variable. So the first thing we have to think about is what happens to the real-world interest rate. And the easiest way to think about this is to think about both economies combined. So if we think about the global economy, what's happened is we've had an increase in national saving, or global saving, with no change in global investment. So now we have an excess supply of loanable funds on a global basis. Whenever we have an excess supply, we should see that the price will fall. The price of loanable funds is the interest rate. So this increase in saving, although it only occurs in the U.S. economy, is also going to cause the world interest rate to decline, and that means that it's going to have an effect on the rest of the world as well. How much does it fall by? Well, we have to find the real interest rate that equates the net export surplus of the U.S. with the net export deficit of the rest of the world. So here's what happens to net exports for the U.S. We know they're still in a surplus. Now again, remember, there's two things that are happening in the U.S. First of all, we have this increase in government saving. Now the real interest rate declines. That decline in the real interest rate means that we're now going to save less, right? It's cheaper to borrow more money, we spend more. So that's going to reduce saving somewhat, and that decline in the real interest rate reduces the cost of borrowing, so businesses now are going to borrow and spend more, so investment goes up. The question we want to ask ourselves is, did this net export surplus in the U.S., after the increase in national savings, go up or down compared to before? That is NX1, forgot to put the 1 in, greater or smaller than NX0? And how would we think about that? How would we figure that out? A big, big hint staring you right in the face. So remember, global savings goes up. That's the initial shock. We now have an endogenous decrease in saving because the real world interest rate comes down, and an endogenous increase in investment because the world real interest rate has come down. So increase in investment, an initial increase in saving, and now an endogenous decrease in saving. I had full head of hair before I started thinking about this. How do I figure it out? How do we figure it out? Don't disappoint. Let's look at what's happening in the rest of the world. Okay? So the key here, when we think about large open economies, and we want to know what happens to net exports, international lending and borrowing, look at the country that didn't have the shock. Right? Look at the rest of the world. We still have to find the real world interest rate that equates these two. If the real world interest rate went down, then in the rest of the world where no shock occurred, then what do we see? The net export deficit got bigger. If the net export deficit in the rest of the world is bigger, that means there's more net foreign borrowing, which means that the U.S. must be doing more net foreign lending. So the net export surplus had to get bigger. Now, the way you want to analyze shocks to large open economies is not to necessarily look at what's happening in the country where the shock occurs. Look at the country where the shock didn't occur. That will tell you what happens to net exports. Oh, that was fun. So what do we see then? An increase in desired saving. The world real interest rate falls. That country's investment goes up. That increase, by the way, that